First, a couple of words from me. My name is Philipp Hofstetter. I am a co-founder and technical lead of the company Sensational AG in Switzerland. We usually do totally boring and enterprisey stuff that is in PHP and SQL, so not really interesting for this here. Personally, I'm a huge fan of JavaScript. I'm a disciple of Crockford, I would like to say. I really loved his new introduction of the language, and it totally caught my eye. And I'm also a big fan of email routing. So it's no wonder that the thing that I'm talking about today combines my enthusiasm for JavaScript with my enthusiasm for email in the end to fulfill a dream that I had back in 2002 when I had a really crude hack in Perl and Exim to make email addresses that have limited validity so that you can give some service your email address. They will send you the confirmation link or the download link or whatever, and that's fine, but the next time they send an email to that address, it will just bounce back. And the idea to really go ahead and do this came when I listened to a Security Now episode where they were talking about a similar service, but I wanted to do something that makes the email that is sent actually appear in your normal inbox. So let's have a look at how this works. This is the website. I have already pre-configured my email address, and I will create an alias that is valid for 2 days or 10 received messages. Whatever is hit first will invalidate the alias, and then it won't be possible to send an email to the alias that is generated. So now this has generated this alias, fs9mxc@tempalias.com. This is the address that the service can now send email to, but only for 2 days or 10 messages. And this goes even a bit farther. If I want to leave a comment on some blog post, but I don't want them to have my real address and I don't want to visit the site, I can use the bookmarklet that I can drag up here. This doesn't work in full screen. So I take this bookmarklet here, put it someplace, go to whatever page I am on, press the bookmarklet button. It will highlight any field I press, and the alias will be generated and inserted there. So you don't even have to go and visit the page to create an alias. So when I decided to do that, I had a couple of requirements for myself. One is that whatever I do must be useful for anybody, not just for me, not just a hack, something that everyone kind of would want to use. It must be free software, Tempalias. Everything is under the MIT license. You can clone it and run it. It should look nice because it should be useful to anybody, and this looking nice is just a requirement for it to be used. And it should be as self-contained as possible. So everyone here can just go to GitHub, clone it, and run it without having to worry about dependencies or something. Just go and run it. And now the first part is how to make it look nice. That's really easy. If you have a friend that can do it. I have an old coworker of mine, and he's really talented at designing. I made this, and he made this, then this, and finally the final design. So that's how I design. I scribble it on paper, and he makes it nice. That works really well. I can highly recommend this. Now, if we are concerned, so to explain how the service works in itself, let me explain to you a bit how email works. Now, an email that you see in your mail client has basically 2 parts. One is the message header that contains the information from whom it's sent, to whom it's sent, the subject, date, and some other headers. And then you could say that this message, when it's transmitted over the network, is put into an envelope. Well, the envelope is basically part of the SMTP protocol. And in the SMTP exchange, the sender tells the server where that email should go, and then it emits the whole email, including header and footer. And MTAs, that's the mail servers in the internet, usually don't look at the message, but they only look at the envelope. Email clients, on the other hand, can't even see the envelope, but they concern themselves only with the message and the message header, which is explained in this diagram here. We have the email, basically, that goes to this alias, this zzx22@tempalias.com is probably sent over some smart host from that service, which we do a lookup in DNS to see who handles email for tempalias.com. They will get back the SMTP tempalias.com name. The email will then be sent to that server. It will do the alias resolution and will finally rewrite the RCP2 header, so that's basically the envelope. So it will also go to the DNS, look for who is responsible for the email address the alias was actually pointing to, connects to that server, sends the original mail with the original address in the header, but changes the recipient so that the email will arrive in that inbox finally at mail.bar.com or wherever. And when doing all this, so you have seen there is a lot of handling and juggling around involved, and I wanted to still keep it accessible for you. So I couldn't do what is usually done with the server. The proxy server does the alias resolution, changes the RCPT envelope, and then sends delivery. Because otherwise I would have to deal with the complicated stuff like mail queues and non-delivery reports and all that things. And I just didn't want to deal with all that. I wanted to write an email proxy, not an email server. So in my initial design, whenever a request came in from some mail server, I immediately connected to the upstream proxy server and then just replayed all the commands between them, just replacing the RCP2 command. Of course, that turned out to be a really stupid design because temp alias is by nature about rejecting email, not about sending email. Because in the best case, that alias will be valid for maybe one message, two messages, whatever. So most of the spam that I want to prevent would then be rejected. So now I changed the design in a way that it does all the alias resolution and all the checks. And then if everything is okay, then I will connect to the upstream server. And whenever anything goes wrong, I just return a nondescript 500 error. Of course, we had to persist these aliases. I thought that SQL was maybe a bit, does more than I basically need. I just need to store aliases. When I did this, the only embedded solution, well, would have been dirty. That was too late that I found out about it. Or SQLite, which was then SQL again. So in the end, I went with Redis, and I'm actually also very happy about this. The alias generation, the alias is the thing in front of the address that is generated, needs to be unique, and I need to make sure that they are never reused. So at first I thought, okay, and also they shouldn't be following each other. So if I get 2@tempalias.com, you probably would also try 3@tempalias.com or 1@tempalias.com just because they look the same. So I could send email to people that I shouldn't be sending email to. So I needed a unique alias that wasn't guessable. I would have used the UUID, but they are really big, even if I encode them like in base 32. So it's just isn't worth it. So I'm now just generating random strings of a specific length. I check, I'm doing a setNix command to Redis to check whether that alias already exists. If it does, then that's bad, and I increase the length of the string by 1, basically by using a 32-character set that I would use to generate the alias, increasing the whole key space by 32 times, hoping not to get another collision anytime soon. When I initially started the service, we were at 4 characters, now we are at 6. And we never reuse an alias, so it's not possible that an email sent to one alias is then sent to another person after the first alias was invalidated. The removal is handled basically not immediately, but the code just doesn't find the alias if it's not valid. And the cron job, on the other hand, runs and purges the unused aliases or the expired aliases every 30 minutes. And I'm not keeping a list of active aliases, which means that I hit Redis pretty hard and just fetch all the aliases, instantiate all of them, check whether they are valid, and then kill the ones that I don't use. This is fine for now, but it's probably something that should be looked at in the future. So now you probably want to see code. It's best or easiest if you visit my GitHub page. fork the project, do a submodules in it, and configure the thing and run it. That's all you have to do. As I said, it's very self-contained. I'm using some external libraries. One is Node Paperboy from Felix that was talking right before me. When working with the Paperboy, I found some minor bugs. I fixed them, and Felix has kindly applied them. I'm also using Redis Node client. I ran into problems there with connections dropping. Redis has a connection timeout after 5 minutes. It will drop the connection, and the Redis library didn't reconnect correctly. I fixed that in one way, sent a patch, but the other guy had a much better solution and implemented that, but it was a really cool discussion that we had on the GitHub interface. And finally, I'm using Node SMTP. Here you are basically have to use my clone now, because the upstream isn't very interested in the changes I made. The changes were to make the server work. That wasn't implemented at all. And to make the client work in chunks. Because before that, you had to basically take all the mail into RAM and then work with it. And because it's generally a hostile environment out there, I don't want to accept basically mail of any size, and I want to be able to quickly terminate the connection once too much data arrives. The front-end web service is plain static HTML. No single byte of the code that you have seen is dynamically generated. That's all static HTML. It's a semi-application. The front-end, so, is forced to use the API that I created for the back-end. And that also means that I didn't need to bolt on an API, so to have my service and other be able to use it. It's just one API, the one that I use, an external service could also use. And that also means that I have, or wanted to be, RESTful in the design of this API, because that really fits well with what Semi gives you to work with. When I began using or developing this, I initially began development using the Express framework, but then I soon found out that Express is very good at dynamically generating HTML, which I didn't want to. It was basically providing its own DSL as a web framework that was very Rails-ish. I didn't want that. I wanted to do something in Node. And finally, I just decided, and then I had a huge problem with serving static HTML or static files with Express. So basically, I was looking around, found Paperboy, and thought this was what I needed, and then from then on worked with Paperboy. And if you have to serve static files, I highly recommend you to do that. Paperboy is extremely cool. And Node itself is awesome. On this machine that you see here, I was doing 1,500 alias generations a second, and I could look up 3,000 a second on this machine here using only one CPU. And on my day job, I'm really happy if I can reach like 50 requests per second, and I was totally blown away when I have seen a Hello World script doing 800 requests per second. And this is just so incredibly fast. And when I announced this on Hacker News and Reddit, it could just handle that traffic flawlessly. Later came the bookmarklet, and I knew that to make this work, I needed jQuery. And but the bookmarklet, when you drag it up to the bookmark bar and execute it, it basically runs in the context of the page that the bookmarklet was loaded on. So I don't know anything about that page, which means I have to be really careful not to mess with whatever is already running on that page. So we had to be really careful in making sure that we are not loading jQuery twice or overriding an already loaded jQuery. And because we're cross-domain, we have to do JSONP, which of course then isn't quite RESTful anymore, but you only get GET requests when you are doing JSONP. So this code seems to be a bit cut off. In the end, it's just showing that it's really important to make sure that, or what I wanted to do here was to not load the code itself. This is this bookmarklet.js thing. Again, if it was already loaded, so whenever you load this bookmarklet script, it will generate one global variable that is named in a way that hopefully doesn't collide with anything, and then it will just execute that. Otherwise, it will create that variable. And if we are loading jQuery, we also have to be extremely careful that we either take the one that we want, if it's the one that is already loaded is the one we want, and if it's not, then we have to be extremely careful that we don't mess up with the jQuery that is already on that page. And Brainlock at Twitter, who also sits here in the audience, could tell you a nice story of what happens if you are not really, really careful here. That can so badly break pages or your bookmarklet if you're not careful. Yeah, and then temp alias was running for a couple of weeks, and then her happened. And if you end up on that page, A, you get a lot of traffic, and B, you get very interesting email asking you very interesting questions in very varying amounts of font sizes and font colors. That was actually very entertaining. And of course, the spam happened. Temp alias was soon used by various bots to basically generate aliases that were valid for one email and one day, or even just one email. The email was sent to that, and then of course the alias was invalidated, but in the end this provided a free relay for whatever spammer was out there. And I admit I made it easy for them by providing this nice API that you could just call. So of course we had to do something about it. Now I'm doing an RBL check whenever a connection is made. That's also really easy to do in Node. It's basically just a DNS query. I couldn't do that in the smart host I was using because that has only seen my connection basically and not the originating connection, so I had to do that myself. I'm also rate limiting the thing so that you can't generate too many aliases per time, and a configuration error made the upstream or the smart host actually trust the temp alias mail server and not do any spam assassin or other spam prevention. I quickly changed that, so now whenever a mail is being relayed, it will also be checked whether it's spam using the usual methods. Now to put this in production use, I had the web part. I mean, whenever you start the service up, it will open two ports. The HTTP port for the web interface and an SMTP port for the SMTP server. The web part I put behind an Nginx proxy, mainly so that I get free HTTP compression and don't have to do it myself. And the SMTP I was running, or is running by default at port 2525, because I'm sure as hell not going to run the first Node application ever on port 25 as root. That's not going to happen. So that's running as its own user where it has no privileges at all, and I'm using IP tables to make it appear that it's running from port 25. Because email in SMTP and DNS and MX, you have no choice, you have to use port 25 if you want to process email. Of course, we still went down. The problem is, and we have heard that this morning, you basically have to be extremely careful with exceptions when you're working with Node. You never get a real call stack with all these asynchronous executions of small callback functions. If one of these callback functions somewhere throws, you can't capture that where it was initially executed, the callbacks, but someplace else, and it's impossible to do real exception handling. So you have to be very, very careful to never throw and to never see or to never have an exception thrown somewhere inside. Of course, I failed horribly at that at first. There were some bugs in Paperboy even that caused this in some rare cases, and the real problem here is file handle starvation. If execution of that one request holds at any time while there is the connection from the outgoing client open, there is the connection to the proxy server open, there might be HTTP connections open, you run out of sockets pretty quickly if you don't close them. And this is what was happening here. Execution of that SMTP transaction or HTTP request stopped at some point to do some exception being thrown, and then the handle was never closed. I made it work much better, but it's still not good, though now after 1 week, we only have 169 sockets open that will never be closed until I restart the server. So we're better, but not quite there yet. So how do we continue from here? Personally, I would really like to see some contributors. I made it easy for you to use. I could have gone with a different design. I went with this so everyone here can easily clone it and run it and maybe improve it. What I also have to do is to fix those sockets leaking, because that just can't work. Restarting that server once a week is very annoying. I would love to see custom domains, so everyone can point his own domain at the temp alias system or the temp alias service, and we would then handle email for that domain. This is to get around block lists that usually begin to block these temporary email address domains. I already have a small ownmx branch on GitHub, but that's really just a quick hack to prove a point in a Hacker News commentary. Don't use that, no good idea. And what I could also do is to change the reply to address so that you could reply to one of these temp alias emails you got from a service, and they would still, you could reply to that originating sender, but they would never see your real email address. But that would require changing the email as it passes through, and I, as an email freak and as email server admin, aside other things, I can't bring myself to touch the email itself. That's dirty, I don't know. So, if there are any questions, feel free to ask them. If I can get any more Twitter followers, I would really appreciate that. And otherwise, thank you for bearing with me. Yeah?
Why don't you set UID instead of going, so that you go onto port 25? Node has that.
Node runs at port 25, that's no problem. But I cannot, if you want to bind to port 25 on the Unix machine, then you basically have to run as root.
No, you have to start as root, then you can set UID to the...
Okay, that's true, I could do that, but in the end it was easier for me to just run the whole thing as a non-root user. Then I don't run into problems with dropping privileges at any time. I just don't have them to begin with. Yeah, here I could use the SMTP Nginx module, that's correct, but then I would have like 2 proxy servers in a row, and that begins to make the whole thing a bit complicated. I could do that, but then an incoming connection would go to Nginx, then to the temp alias server, and then to the upstream server, and that's just one proxy too many that I can handle with just the IP tables redirection. I actually don't log how many emails I process. I'm really careful when I did this service. I wrote this privacy policy that clearly states I do not log anything, basically. What I can say is that I generated around 200,000 aliases, so I have around 200,000 reservations in the system. But as I said, these things, the aliases themselves get deleted once they are not used, so I can't tell you anything more about this. It just runs. Well, the public part, the public-facing part, because that's all static HTML, is easily updated. When I change something in the API, I have to restart the server, basically. But that happens once every week anyway, until I close the leaks. Very well. Thank you very much.